Okay, let's get cracking, let's make some bread. We're going to be using the slow white dough using the sponge and dough method that's available as a download. We're into a two-stage process, and this is where the long fermentation comes in. This is the secret to a really good loaf of bread. The sponge and dough technique is an old English technique for making bread, and it basically just means that you need to start the process the night before you want to make bread the next morning. So when you get home from work, kind of 5 or 6 o'clock, you need to make your sponge. I'm going to weigh that out for you now and show you how it works. It's basically just white flour, water, some yeast and a tiny bit of salt. Okay, so scales on. Then when you put your bowl on, just zero it. You're starting from 0. Okay. This recipe has 400 grams of strong white flour. You just measure that in. Okay. And then a 0 in my bowl. The sponge has a tiny bit of dry yeast in it. That's because we're going to let this dough ferment overnight, and it doesn't need lots of yeast. It wants to go slowly. So on your recipe there's only 1.5 grams of yeast, which is, you know, literally tiny amount. So go steady. That's it already. Okay, 0 in my bowl again. I'm going to add salt. There's 8 grams of salt going into this. Salt actually performs a really important function when you're making real bread. It acts as a brake on fermentation, so it slows things down again. It's not just about adding flavour to the bread, but it actually performs a really useful function. So we need to get some salt into this sponge. And then finally we're on to water, so it's 225 grams of water. This is the bit where you need to go steady. It's easier to put less in and add more. Okay, 225. So then take your bowl off your scales, and then we just need to mix it together. The thing to say about this is it's really stiff when you start combining it. I'm going to just spread my fingers out into a kind of whisk shape and start working the water into the flour. It takes quite a bit of effort to get this dough to come together. If you've ever made pasta, it's a little bit like that. There's not a huge amount of water in this dough, and that's again because we start with a very stiff dough the night before, and over time that gets softened with the fermentation process, and you end up with a lovely light bubbly sponge to use the next day. But as you can see, we've got something that almost looks like breadcrumbs in the bottom of this bowl, so we've got to really work it together. Start squishing it together with your hands. Just keep working it until you bring all the dough together. See, it's starting to become one cohesive mass now. Okay, I'm just going to work it in the bowl for another 30 seconds. Keep working the dough around until you've got all the dry bits incorporated. And then just in the bowl, start to knead it. And by kneading it, I'm just putting the pressure of the heel of my hand onto the dough to squish it down, basically. Once you've got a nice clean bowl, you can move that out of the way and just do a bit more work on the table. As you can see, it's really tough. So all I'm doing is working it with the heel of my hand until it becomes a cohesive mass, really. We want to make sure there's no dry bits, no obvious lumpy bits of dry flour. And once you've got that going, just a minute's worth of kneading or so at the most. Then you stop, and that's it. And I'm going to stop right there. As you can see, it's quite tough, very stiff. As it is, probably wouldn't make a very nice loaf of bread right now, but this is where the magic happens. It's going to go back in the bowl, sit there overnight. You need to cover it with a plastic bag. Just leave it out at room temperature overnight. And by morning, it'll have expanded into a lovely, soft, workable sponge that we're then going to add to fresh flour and water in the morning and make our bread dough. Right, this has now been fermenting overnight, and as you can see, it's changed character quite dramatically. It's got an open structure, it's expanded obviously, and if we get in there and look underneath, you can see all this lovely kind of lacy, spiderwebby structure. And that's basically the gluten that's formed these lovely long strands, and that's going to form the skeletal structure of your bread as it ferments and rises upwards. So this is, this is sponge as it should look. We're going to use this now as an ingredient in our final loaf.